Hi, folks. I'm John Chrastka, Executive Director for EveryLibrary and the EveryLibrary Institute. This is Intro to Big Data and Audience Segmentation. That's part of our training series with the Utah State Library, and want to invite you to spend a little time with my colleague Patrick P.C. Sweeney today. I'm doing this quick intro here before he gets into the session. Wanted to take you through, make sure this is rooted in the work that we're doing across the training program. This is segment that's part of our Marketing to Build support session. This is intended for all staff at libraries around the state of Utah. Of course, library directors, library boards are welcome to spend a little time with us. This training is coming out of the experience we have at the EveryLibrary Institute, which is our 501c3 public policy, tax policy, education policy, research and training center. We do a lot of this kind of training for state libraries around the country, state library associations. It's focused on kind of an all-staff conversation, but in particular, people who are doing marketing outreach, looking to position the library online in the digital space and also in real-world settings. So Patrick's going to take you through a couple of key things in this presentation. We're going to look at communication theory. We're going to review best practices. We're going to discuss some of the bigger digital tactics that are out there that are used by issue organizations. EveryLibrary, the political action committee side of our work, the 501c4 that we have, is one of those organizations, of course, as well. So we are, looking to talk to the American public about the big issues of the day that affect libraries, that influence the way that librarians and library workers can do their work in their libraries around the country. So we hope that you'll be able to spend a little time with us with this webinar session, to understand digital communication theory, to look at these best practices in digital management, and then to be able to apply them to your particular context, whether you're a large library, a small library, in a urban setting, suburban, exurb, rural. We really feel that this is going to be very applicable to the experience that Utah libraries have. So again, my colleague Patrick Sweeney is going to take over in just a second. His contact information is here for you. And we look forward to spending some time on this conversation individually. If you need it as well, you can reach out anytime. We'll be able to help think things through for you for your particular library. All right, I'm going to give it over to Patrick now. Thanks.
Hello, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Patrick P.C. Sweeney, and I'll be your host today. Today, we're going to be talking about Introduction to Big Data and Audience Segmentation. And I'm especially excited about this webinar because a lot of people don't realize how easy it is to do, to use big data and how to segment audiences. It's incredibly easy, it's incredibly inexpensive, and quite literally any library can do it through Facebook, through email, through a lot of the different methods that we're going to talk about today. And we're also going to talk about how this is going to help you and your library increase donations, increase volunteers, increase attendance at your events. This is singly one of the biggest things that a library can do, is learn how to use big data in their marketing and how to segment their audiences. So in this webinar, of course, I am Patrick P.C. Sweeney. As I said, you can find me online as P.C. Sweeney. This is a pre-recorded webinar. So if you have any questions while you're listening to it, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at PC Sweeney. You can also find me on any social media as PC Sweeney. Also, if you'd like, you can have a conversation with me about anything that we've discussed today. If you have a question, if you have comments, if you want to talk through how to do some of this stuff at your library, please feel free to reach out to me. Just all you have to do is put something on my calendar at calendly.com/PC Sweeney. Again, that's calendly.com/PC Sweeney. And you can just schedule a 15, 20, 30-minute talk with me at your convenience. So I hope to hear from you. And let's dive right in. So first of all, a lot of what we're talking about is coming from politics. And it's coming from politics largely because the political world has done a lot of work using big data, segmenting audiences, and understanding how to do that to influence people to take action on their behalf. And it doesn't matter what that action is, it turns out. A lot of the methods to get people to take action are exactly the same, whether you want them to take action to vote, write letters to the editor, sign a petition, attend a rally, come to your story time, volunteer. It doesn't matter. Basically, it's all the same, whatever that action is. And in fact, campaigns have spent billions and billions of dollars every single year running ads and understanding data and building these really complex data systems in order to encourage people to take action. The other reason why we're learning from politics instead of, say, the corporate world like Nike or Pepsi or how they use audience segmentation is because it's a little bit different. They're building brand recognition, but what we're doing is we're moving people through a ladder of engagement, remember. And this goes back to that first webinar that we did, Introduction to Advocacy. That's still available if you want to go back and watch that. But we're learning from politics because they are so effective and because the cycle that we're trying to get people on in order to build support for funding libraries is more closely related to politics than it is to corporate brands, to selling something to people. The other big reason that we're learning from politics is because 98% of library funding is political in nature, which means we have to work in that political environment. We have to understand that political environment if we want to get the funding we need to continue to do our jobs. 90% comes typically, on average, it comes at the local level, the decisions of local legislators, the decisions of local voters. 3 to 5% comes from the state. That's also political. 3 to 5 comes from the feds. That's also political. Only about 2% of library funding is not political, and that is philanthropic in nature. That accounts for only 2% of library funding across the country. So really, when we talk about library funding, we are talking about politics. And that's why we're pulling all of this information from the political world. And what influences politics? This is important to understand. There are only two things that influence politics, and that is people and that is money. You need to be able to have one of those two things if you want to have political power or influence. If you don't have a database of library supporters, or if you don't have thousands and thousands or millions of dollars that you can use to influence politics, you don't have political power. That political power is the important thing that you need in order to continue to fund your libraries. And we see that organizations like the police or the fire department are very, very good at using political power to influence elections, to influence campaigns, to influence legislators to ensure that they get the funding that they need. Libraries are allowed to use all of those same tools and tactics, and we're going to talk about a lot of those here. Now, unfortunately, libraries probably aren't going to have like Koch brothers level political action funding. We're never going to have millions and millions and millions of dollars. But what is nice is that a significant percentage of the population loves libraries. And what that means is that we can rally the public on an individual level to become a sort of people power pack in our community. Just like organizations like Democracy for America or those kinds of political action committees, we can get people on our side. And with those people, we can drive them to take action that benefits the library, that ensures that we get the funding that we need. And we're going to talk more about that. The first thing that you need to understand is that you don't have a supporter unless you have their name, their address, their phone number, or their email address. You need to have their names or something about them. Otherwise, you don't have them as a supporter. If you can't contact them, if you can't identify them, if you don't know who they are in your community, they are not your supporter. They're eligible to become somebody else's supporter because somebody else can communicate with them. Now, back in the day, this was done on 3x5 cards. Old campaigns in the 70s and 80s, early 90s, had huge drawers of 3x5 cards that had a profile on every single voter. Each card was a profile on each individual voter in that community. What issues they cared about, were they contacted, who they contacted them, what method were they contacted, how do they prefer to be contacted, what messages resonated with them. All of that data was on these 3x5 cards. A little while later, it moved to Excel, and now we see it on Google Sheets. But basically, it moved to spreadsheets, it moved to digital. And then really with Howard Dean's campaign is where we started building these big online databases that volunteers could access, that accumulated data, that appended data in really interesting ways. Every library uses Nation Builder, but you can also use things like Salesforce or another CRM, MailChimp Constant Contact. That is a database of library supporters. There's also ones like Salsa Labs or Network for Good that are built around donations and fundraising. Those are all fine. I personally prefer Nation Builder. This is a great platform that I believe every library should be using. And the reason that we build this database of supporters is because of this recommendation. This recommendation comes right out of the OCLC study called Awareness to Funding, where they said that we need to cultivate and empower our super supporters to take action on our behalf. However, what they left out in this recommendation that I think is absolutely key is that we have to identify, cultivate, and empower our super supporters, because the big issue is that we don't know who our super supporters are. And if we don't know who they are because we haven't taken the time to identify them, to build that database of library supporters in our community, then there's no way for us to cultivate and empower those super supporters, right? We have to identify them first. So I added the word identify. But identify, cultivate, and empower super supporters. I was so excited to see this in the Awareness to Funding study, because this is such a key aspect of building support and building political power for any cause, organization, and especially our libraries. Now remember, this is a ladder of engagement that we're taking people through. We're moving people from unaware of why libraries are important in 2020, for example, and we're making them become aware of it. Once people are aware of libraries and why they're important, we have to drive them to become observers. Take that next initial step, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. We talked about this in previous webinars. With that point, we have them as supporters. Once we have them as supporters, we can start identifying, we can start appending data. We have them in our database. We know who they are. We know how to contact them. We can start learning how they prefer to be contacted: mail, phone, text message, Facebook, whatever, right? That's when we can start driving them to become advocates. And we're going to talk more about this process in depth in this webinar. So the audience engagement roadmap, if you remember again from that first webinar that we did, this is what we're talking about here. We're moving people through this cycle, and using big data and audience segmentation is a key aspect of this, because in fact, it's that very first circle where it says data, right, for your initial audience. Facebook polling, Axiom surveys, those are all just ways to get some data in order to build that initial unaware audience. Once you have that initial audience, you can start educating them with stories, statistics, email, social media, vision of the future. This is where libraries transform, Geek the Library, I Love My Library, all those campaigns come into play. So that they become aware. Now we get them into our database, giveaways, join emails, like us on Facebook, Twitter, all that kind of stuff. Helps them become observers. Then we start building data around them through surveys, polls, or data appends. We have an enhanced set of identified supporters. And that's when we can really start segmenting our audiences and targeting them with A/B tested messages, which we'll talk about later in another webinar. Problem agitation solution messages, 2793 messages. And again, these are all things we'll talk about in the messaging webinar, which is the fifth webinar in the series. Once we have good messaging that we're targeting these segmented audiences with, in the ways that they prefer to receive those messages, we start to radicalize them about libraries. This is where they're like, you'll get my library card from me when you pull it from my cold dead hands, right? That's what we're talking about here. Then we go through the self-ID, self-ID supports. We'll talk about that another time. But for now, what you need to understand is just how this kind of fits into this audience engagement roadmap. So there are 4 kinds of supporters. And this is really important to understand, because each of these 4 kinds of supporters interacts with your library, and the way that they support your library in a different way. And if you don't understand how or why they support them, then you're never going to be able to engage them properly. Now you have relational supporters, which we talked a little bit about in the last webinar. These are people that you know. These are the people closest to you. These are the people that you can pick up the phone and call because you have a personal relationship to them. Then you have ideological supporters, and ideological supporters are a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this webinar. Ideological supporters are people who care about what you're saying and what you're doing because they have a shared set of values or beliefs. And you can find them on Facebook, you can find them through data appends, but you don't know them personally. Then we have aversion supporters. Aversion supporters are people who support your library, for example, because they're against something else. Or a better example, or an easier to understand example is, I voted for Hillary because I was against Trump, or I voted for Trump because I was against Hillary, not necessarily because I was for Trump, or not necessarily because I was for Hillary, right? I voted for this candidate because I was really against the other candidate. And we see this sometimes in libraries, but not real often. And we also have access supporters. Now, libraries don't have a lot of access supporters. Access supporters are people who support a candidate or a cause because they want to gain access to the political power, influence, that organization has or that individual has. So if I give a large donation to Hillary Clinton, it's because I want access to Hillary Clinton, then I'm a access donor. If I volunteer for an organization simply because I want access to that organization, then I am an access volunteer. So these are the 4 kinds of supporters that we need to understand. And we need to start with the data. Now, we went into this a little bit earlier because this is the data webinar. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into it. Now, we're going to start with the civic attitudes. And understanding these civic attitudes is important. This is from a Pew report from 2016. And I don't think this is surprising to any of us. And when it came out, I don't think very many librarians were surprised by what they heard. Now, number one, millennials use libraries at a higher rate than any other demographic. Parents are more likely to use libraries than adults without children. The majority of Americans hold very positive views about libraries. These are all great things to understand, not necessarily what we're looking for, but we'll talk about why in just a second. But these are good things to understand to start building some messaging around. This is how people see libraries. They see libraries as a safe place. Again, this is Pew Research. They see the library as a source of educational opportunity. They trust the information that comes from the library. And they see the library as a place to ignite creativity in young people. People generally see the library as a place that helps build a better future, that helps give a vision of a better future in their community. People who support the library tend to support it because it's something that they see as the good of the other. And we see that often in this data. In fact, when we see how people feel about closing a local public library, how they feel it would hurt their communities far outweighs how much they feel it would impact them and their own families, which I think is really fascinating because people think libraries are good for their community, but could they live without it? Sure, right? But could the community live without it? Absolutely not. And we hear that over and over and over again in a lot of the public opinion polling that we do at EveryLibrary. Now, the other thing that we see here is the voter attitudes. Now, this is where we start getting into some really important data. Voters, now this is specifically just voters, and this comes from the OCLC fund study, Awareness to Funding again. In 2018, they found that 55% of voters saw the library as an essential local institution. 58% of voters saw the library as advancing education. 53% of voters saw it as a source of community pride. 51% of voters believe that libraries enhance the quality of life in their community. These are all also very great things to have. However, again, we are only half the population on this on average, right? And so we need to start building this up. But these are great nuggets that we can start building some messaging from. We're not going to dive deep into messaging in this webinar, but we will talk about how to segment these audiences a little bit in this webinar. So we need to understand these 4 basic things that voters understand about libraries. Now, in 2008, they did this. This is again from Awareness to Funding. They did the study once in 2008, once in 2018. In 2008, this is what the data looked like. 37% of voters would definitely vote yes for the library. 37% would likely to vote yes for the library. Those are your maybe voters, right? 26% of the community are likely or definitely going to vote no against the library. Now, watch what happened here. This is where it gets very devastating. Between 2008 and 2018, 10 years have passed, and here's where we dropped. Only 27% of voters in America would definitely vote yes for the library now. That's a 10% loss in 10 years. We've lost 6% of our likely to vote yes for the library community, and 42% are likely or definitely going to vote no against the library. And this is very devastating for us. And we often hear, well, you know, libraries are doing just as well now at the ballot as they ever did before. Well, that's true because we're only at 42% definitely vote no, but we've lost 10%. Once this 42% gets above 50% of people likely or definitely voting no for libraries, we're going to see a precipitous decline in library funding across the country. Because remember, library funding is political. We are not going to have library funding if people are unwilling to vote for it. Once this number hits 50%, and if the trends continue, we have 8 years to get here or 7 years now, then we are going to be in a lot of trouble in 7 years when when ballot initiatives start to significantly fail. So this is something that we need to fix. And this is what this audience segmentation and understanding this data and understanding the messaging, which is the later webinar, really comes into play. We have to start understanding this right now in order to fight against this. Now, of course, we went into this in the last two webinars. I'm not going to dive deeply into it, but just to reiterate, we have lost 16% of support from our super supporters who are willing to vote yes, but they like libraries more than they ever have before. And what that means is that if our measurement of success for our advocacy and the work that we're doing to promote libraries, if our measurement of success is that people like libraries more, then we're succeeding. But if our measurement is that people are willing to tax themselves to fund the library so that we all have jobs so we can continue to serve our communities, then we are drastically failing. And of course, we lost 6 or 7% of our probable supporters as a percentage of the population, and we lost 11% that would vote yes as a segment of the population. This is extremely devastating, and they like libraries as much as they ever did before. This is fascinating data because it means that our advocacy is working if people like libraries. Our advocacy is failing if it's they're voting for libraries, right? So the thing that I want you to remember while we're doing this is that political party doesn't matter. And what that means is that Democrats and Republicans are just as likely to vote yes or no for the library, almost the exact same rate. This is validated in poll after poll after poll. This big data point really comes from the awareness to funding study again. I highly recommend you read those two studies. But what this means is that we can't segment our data by Democrat or Republican. We can't make that distinction when we're targeting voters to talk about the libraries. We can't only call Republicans, we can't only call Democrats, because it just doesn't work that way. They're just as likely to vote yes or no for libraries. And this builds on to why it's so important that we segment our audiences in different ways, because while they do support us at the same rate or not support us at the exact same rate even, they like to be talked to in different ways and have different language, which we're going to talk about in that messaging webinar. If we can't segment them, then we can't talk to them in the way that they want to understand. We can't get them to support us. We'll talk deeply about this later on. The other thing that I want to make clear is that you cannot segment your audiences by who uses the library and who doesn't if you want to build support, because card statistics just don't matter when it comes to voting for libraries. We've seen libraries pass with only 30% cardholder rate. We've seen libraries lose with an 80% cardholder rate. Cardholder rates have no correlation to the passage or failure of library campaigns or ballot initiatives or political actions of any kind. And that's largely because there's no distinction between a user and a non-user in their likeliness to support a library. I'm not making this data up. Again, this comes from the OCLC and awareness to funding studies. This also is validated in a lot of our local polling that we do on a lot of our campaigns. There's no statistically significant difference between a user and a non-user in their likeliness to vote yes or no for a library. That's because the discussion is different. There are a lot of people who will use the library, but they believe somebody else should pay for them. They believe that taxation is theft. They love using the library, but Jeff Bezos should pay for it, right? We hear that all the time. We also hear people who don't use the library who are thrilled that the library exists. We have entire wings of libraries named after people who made multi-million-dollar donations who haven't stepped foot in the library in the last 20 years, right? There are people who support your library who will never use it. There are people who don't support your library who use it every single day. And that's important to understand. So let's talk about what is big data. Because understanding what big data is, I think, is really important. We use the terms big data fairly often in this industry in a way that I don't think really accurately defines it. Big data means that we are using large data sets from some of the big vendors from multiple data points in order to build profiles of our supporters so that we can understand them, individual profiles to do micro-targeting, so we can understand who our supporters are, what they care about, what they want, what activates them, how to message to them, and all of those kinds of things. And if you're not pulling in data from multiple sources, if you're only pulling it in from one source, or if you only have one or two data points on them, that's not big data. Big data means you know what issues they care about, how their net income, their wealth, are they married, are they homeowners, do they drive a blue Subaru or a red Ford, do they subscribe to magazines, are they a sci-fi reader, do they use the library, do they not use the library, in order to build up these audiences that you can then use for targeting. We're going to talk a lot about that today. But one thing that I want to say is that we have so much wrong with the data that we currently use. Number one is that we have very little. There is no data set in this country that helps us determine who supports libraries or why. We don't know the socioeconomic, demographic, racial, gender specific backgrounds of a library supporter. Are library supporters predominantly white? Are they predominantly black? Are they predominantly Latinx? I don't know. We have no idea. We don't know if library supporters are typically homeowners, non-homeowners, renters. They read a lot of books. Do they work from home? Are they younger? Are they older? None of that data has ever been built. So targeting our supporters becomes very difficult because we don't have a data set to validate against. When we look at building support around political data, we can't target Republicans, we can't target Democrats because both of those support libraries in the same way. What that means is if we're doing a political campaign, I have to call all the voters on the voter file. I can't just call Republicans or just call Democrats. I have to call everybody because we are a nonpartisan issue, right? I can't say that we call women with children more often in a campaign to get them to vote yes, because we don't know if that's the demographic that supports libraries. And if we don't understand those demographics that support libraries, then we can't identify, cultivate, and empower our super supporters because we, again, don't know who our super supporters are. This is terrifying because the organizations that are vehemently anti-tax and anti-government, the Koch brothers, the Tea Party, the libertarian parties have these data sets so that they can target the people who are against taxes and against government, and they can target them to come out against tax-funded government organizations such as the library. And we've seen this over and over and over again. We've seen the Koch brothers come out against libraries. We've seen the Libertarian Party come out against libraries. We've seen the Tea Party come out against libraries. And they use sophisticated data to target their populations in order to rally them to take action against library funding measures. And if we can't fight back, if we can't understand it, we are going to get destroyed. And this is why we are losing voter support. It's not because people like libraries less. It's because they don't like taxes and they don't like government because they're being targeted with anti-tax, anti-government rhetoric from organizations that have the data and have the funding to do that targeting well. We want to understand how to build support for library funding through the use of big data, audience segmentation, and targeting. So we have to start with that audience. That's the very first thing that we do. And in order to start with an audience, you have to figure out a group of people who are demographically similar in your community. What do they care about? Or is it a demographic that likes science fiction? Is it a demographic that subscribes to magazines? Is it a demographic that owns their own home? Is it a demographic that makes over a certain amount of money? Are they married? Do they have kids? All of those kinds of things. So that you build a demographically similar audience that you can target with messages that resonate with them. And the reason that this is so critical is because, for example, on Facebook, if you just target everybody in your community with one big ad that says, come to story time at 7 p.m. or whatever, and you put it in front of everybody in your community, well, guess what? You just spent a bunch of money putting ads in front of people who don't have children who are likely to come to story time, who aren't the right age to come to story time, if you aren't using that data to target those audiences, right? If you're doing a program on entrepreneurship and you just put an ad out to everybody in your community about entrepreneurship, you are spending a bunch of money putting that ad in front of people who don't care. And if you spend a nickel in front of somebody unwilling to take action or unlikely to take action, then you just wasted that nickel. Now, if you can take that nickel and you can put that ad in front of somebody who you know is going to become engaged, who's going to take action because that is something that you know they care about based on their demographic attributes, then you spent your nickel wisely. Now, if you were a campaign or a cause that had all the money and all the resources in the world, you would absolutely put every ad out to everybody all the time and just kind of do the shotgun method and hope it all sticks. But we can't because we don't have that kind of resources. So you have to start with that audience. The other thing I want to say is that big data is not your ILS. We are not going to mingle your ILS data with your big data list. We aren't going to mingle that data at all. We aren't going to care what people check out. We aren't going to get into any violations of their privacy. I am talking about people who are opting in. I'm talking about people who want to be targeted, right? I'm not talking about taking their data out of your ILS and putting it somewhere else necessarily. We aren't talking about that. The other thing I want to talk about is that big data is not anonymous. This is important to understand because if we anonymize all the data, then it becomes kind of meaningless. We have to know that this person cares specifically about this because they have these things, because they have these attributes, because they believe in these things. And you can't use anonymous data for Facebook targeting or for social media targeting or for email lists or all those other kinds of targeting that we really need to do. Big data simply is not anonymous. And again, we're talking about opt-in. Now, if we want to build these audiences, we have to really look at a couple of things. Now, first of all, audience segmentation means we take a large group of people, we use that big data to build demographic profiles of very specific audiences so that we can segment them down to people who care about different issues, people who believe in different things, people who have different values. Remember, this is our ideological group of supporters. We want to get them segmented down to different groups that are demographically similar, right? Issues that they care about that are similar. And this is very, very important because once you understand how messaging works, you will start to see why the segmentation is so important. Now, a lot of libraries tell the community what they want the community to know about their library. That Libraries Transform campaign, we're just putting things out in front of the community and in front of everybody and hoping that some of those things stick to the people that we're telling it to. And the problem with this is that we're telling the community what we want them to hear. What we need to be doing is tell the community what the community wants to hear. When you look at how messaging works, each community member has a various set of issues that they care about. For example, education or public safety or the local economy, for example. And what we need to do is we need to tell that community member, if they care about education, we need to specifically talk to that community member or that audience of community members that we used to, because we segmented that audience to everybody who cares about education. Then we put a message in front of that audience that says, you know who else cares about education? The library. Here's how the library improves education in the community. Here's how the library improves public safety in the community for people who care about public safety. Here's how the library improves the economic stability of the community. And we put that in front of the audience that cares about economics, right? And we attach the library to their already held values and beliefs. We don't try and create new ones within them. And this is such an important distinction to understand. We're not telling the community what we want them to know. We're telling the community what they want to hear. What do they need to know about the library built upon what is it that they already care about? That is how you engage them in a meaningful way that gets them to take action. Now, of course, messaging is only part of the puzzle. We're not going to get deep into messaging in this webinar. That is our final webinar. But I just want to point out that these are different ways that you can segment audiences. We'll talk about how in this webinar on how to segment them in order to engage them in a way that's meaningful. So people, you can segment people by class, race, gender, religion. Those are social identities, social circles, people who are in school, people who didn't graduate high school, people who are in college, people who congregate around civic centers, various workplaces, people who do different fields of study or different fields of work tend to have different sets of values, political affiliations, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Tea Party, etc. You can also segment audiences by who they care about, which politicians do they follow, which authors do they like, which actors, sports figures, etc. You can make some set of assumptions by people who are big fans of Colin Kaepernick, for example, right? You can make a set of assumptions about people who are big fans of Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama or Donald Trump. Those are different sets of peoples. They follow different opinion leaders and they believe in different opinion leaders. And you can segment them out by those kinds of things. Well, again, we'll talk about how. So where can we get some of these audiences? Some of my favorites are A to Z databases and Reference USA. You can also do it through social hacking. And social hacking is interesting because it does a couple of different things. For example, if you can determine that this audience of people through maybe a Facebook ad go to this address, and it's maybe a civic center or a garden community or the Rotary Club's address, you can actually target people within that building on Facebook with ads and around things that they care about, because that's where they congregate. You can also do Orange Boy or Analytics on Demand, which are ones from our vendors, Gale and Orange Boy. You can also build them. Building them is fascinating because you can do it in a bunch of different ways. Number one, you can go to like your local museum and you can go to their donor wall and you can write down the names of everybody on that donor wall. Then you can go to A to Z databases, get their address, name, phone number. You can build an audience out of them. We'll talk to you about how to target them in just a minute. You can also build them by passing around a clipboard at every single story time. I can't tell you how important it is that at every contact point that you in your library, that you build that email list. Every time you have a meeting, every time you have a program, pass around a clipboard that says name, email address, and that's all you have to do. When people get that clipboard that says name and email address, they'll just sign it. Then everybody who attends a story time, they go in your constant contact with like a story time tag. Everybody who attends the entrepreneur classes go into your constant contact with an entrepreneurial tag. If you're not doing that, that's a real easy, simple way to start building and segmenting your audiences, because they came to those programs, that's what they care about, right? You can buy and append audiences, and this is, of course, a little bit more expensive, but it's actually very, very cheap. Axiom and Experian are two places to get some big data sets. When Facebook was a lot more open before Cambridge Analytica, you could get free audiences added to your Facebook account around things like people who were on the boards of local charities, people who are on the boards of foundations. You could target people who subscribe to magazines or drive red Subarus or whatever kind of demographic you want. You could get that added to Facebook and do some serious micro-targeting. You can't really do that anymore for free. You have to pay for it now through Axiom or Experian. You can get political data through organizations like L2 Political or Aristotle or PDI. And these are companies that you can actually build audiences around the issues that the people care about. So if you want to get an audience of people who care about education is an issue, around public safety as an issue, you can get that really great issue-driven data into your database through L2 and Aristotle. We'll just append them to your database. We'll show you the backside of the database in a little bit. You can pull them from your voter files. Voter files are fairly inexpensive. You can get enhanced voter files that have a ton of data on them. You can just get the voter file from your local Board of Elections. You can use that for targeting in a bunch of different ways. Donorsearch.net is a great way to pull down lists of philanthropic donors. Accurate Append is a great way to append your database with things like wealth indicators, whether they have children present, all of those kinds of things in a real inexpensive and easy way. You can do it manually, and it's free through A to Z databases, but doing it through Accurate Append just costs you money. The next thing, of course, is pulling in big data. If you aren't doing polling in your community, I highly recommend it. And I recommend not doing it through SurveyMonkey. I recommend hiring a firm, because getting that polling wrong, as we saw in the 2016 elections, can be very, very devastating. That data has to be extremely accurate, extremely tight, if you want it to be effective and accurate and useful. If you have the means to do public opinion polling, please do it. We do a lot of campaigns in the country. Some communities are far too small to do very good public opinion polling. That's okay. We can talk about other ways to get around that. If you can do public opinion polling, please do it. You're going to find out a lot of really fascinating things. For example, we worked on Ferguson, Missouri's campaign about a year after the riots. They called us in January. They wanted to go to the voters in April. We asked them to slow down because obviously a lot of political things had happened in that community. We have to take a measurement of where the public is before we go to the voters. Because if you go to the voters and you lose, it's 5 to 10 years before you can run another campaign, another ballot initiative again, and expect it to pass. Voters will just remember the last time they turned it down, and they'll turn it down the second time out of spite. What came back is that even though that library did a magnificent job during the riots, it was the only functioning piece of government. They were able to raise $500,000 across the country. Scott Bonner won all kinds of awards. The library won all kinds of awards. Only 42% of the public would vote yes for that library. And that's because the community that library helped was different than the library, than the community that voted. And that was an important distinction for us to understand. So we were able to use the data from the polling to build messages, to do targeting, to talk to the voters in a way that mattered to them, and they wound up passing with 62% 2 years later. So we took 2 years to reset that voter narrative around that public opinion polling that we did in order to ensure a pass in 2 years, instead of guaranteeing a failure in 3 months and then having to wait 5 to 10 years before we could go again, right? You can also find out some fascinating things like why the community supports the libraries. We ran a campaign in Washington, and we're going to run the campaign on a discussion around education, vision of a better future with more educated children. But what it turned out is that the community overwhelmingly supported the library because of its services to seniors. When we asked the library what services to seniors the public was talking about, the library had no idea. For some reason, in the psyche of the voters in that community, they latched on to the services to seniors. And if you don't know that and you run on the wrong platform or you put the wrong messages out, you lose your campaign. Doing that polling early and often is what ensures that you get a win. Let's talk about privacy real quick. Now, I want to make a distinction. I am not talking about pulling data down that A, doesn't already exist, or B, that people aren't opting into. The best data is the data that people opt into. And in fact, the best thing to happen to political data and nonprofit data in the UK was GDPR. GDPR simply codified the best big data practices that all of these nonprofits, that all the political parties should have been putting into practice in the beginning. Cleaning data, ensuring people have opted in, ensuring people that want to be contacted. All of that drives up engagement on all of your lists, on all of your platforms, and it significantly decreases your cost because you're not keeping unnecessary data. I highly recommend following GDPR rules for any of the data work that you're doing. It is incredibly effective in making sure that you are using your data as efficiently as possible. So please use opt-ins, let people know how you're using their data, be very open and upfront about it, because that ensures that you're using data in the best possible way. So let's talk about how we put all of this to use. So let's talk about Facebook real quick. Now, first of all, if you haven't gone to business.facebook.com and signed your library up for the business side of Facebook, which is different than just running an ad off the front page, you will get access to all of the terrifying, scary Russian tools. And we're going to talk deeply about this. Now, we're going to talk really deeply about this in the digital tools webinar, which is the next one that we're doing, but we're going to kind of introduce it here. Sign up for business.facebook.com, set your library Facebook page up that way, and you'll get access to some of these tools. One of those tools is Audience Insights, and Audience Insights is amazing because you can build these audiences in Facebook around age, gender, who they like, who they follow, what stores they prefer, what their careers are, their ages, what their interests are, to help build these really highly targeted audiences by location, of course, because you want to target people in your community. Spend some time playing with Audience Insights and build some audiences, and then target those audiences with the things you know they care about. So for example, you can target everybody in your community who works in the education industry with messages about how the library impacts education and supports their educational role in the community. Facebook custom messages is my other big favorite thing. Now, what you can do with Facebook custom messages is you can pull an audience down. I'm going to take you through it in just a second. You can pull an audience down from A to Z databases, and you can upload it as a customer file. Now, we're going to ignore how scary this is for right now. If you upload a customer file into Facebook custom audiences, what you can do is you can upload the name, the zip code, and the phone number. And with those pieces of information, Facebook will match them to their Facebook account. You didn't upload anything digital. It'll match them to their Facebook account with something like a 90% accuracy rate, which is terrifying. Whatever. Let's ignore that for a minute. This allows you to pull in outside files that you got from someplace else, upload them into Facebook, and then target them. So everybody who attended Storytime, if you get a big enough list, you can upload that into Facebook, and you can target those people with messages about importance of Storytime, when the next story time is, etc. Right? You can use your ILS data. Now Facebook deletes the data after you upload it. It just uses it to build that audience. It doesn't know that you're uploading an audience of people in your ILS. It doesn't know where that audience came from. It doesn't know how you're using it exactly. So you're not giving Facebook anything, but you can upload your ILS data and you can target everybody in your community who has a library card. What you can also do, which is I think really, really fascinating, is that you can go to A to Z databases. You can pull a list of everybody who lives in your community. You can compare it to your ILS data, pull out everybody who doesn't have a library card, and then you can upload everybody who doesn't have a library card into Facebook custom audiences, target them with ads about why they should care about the library, why they should come to the library, about asking them to come get a library card. A to Z databases also has lists of everybody who just moved into your community. So you can put out an ad that says, welcome to Sunnyvale, come check out the library, get a new library card. You can do a lot of different stuff with this customer file by pulling in audiences from other resources. So let's look at, this is from A to Z databases. Now, A to Z databases, Reference USA, they're very, very similar. There's a couple of nuanced differences, which we're not going to get into, but these are some of the things that you can start segmenting an audience by in A to Z databases. City, state, metro, all that geography. You can do specific names. You can do phone numbers. You can do age, gender, if they're the head of household, household information, interests, hobbies, lifestyles. What I think is really, really fascinating is this interests, hobbies, and lifestyles, because there's a bunch of stuff that this comes down to. For example, you can pull a list of everybody who is a donor and what kinds of things they donate to if you're doing a capital campaign. You can pull a list of everybody who listens to audiobooks if you want to target people who have a behavior listening to audiobooks. You can pull down that list, upload it as a customer file in Facebook, target them with ads about how you can get your audiobooks from Overdrive or whatever app you use. People who read science fiction, if you have a magazine subscription platform, you can target everybody in your community who subscribes to magazines with an ad about how they can get their magazines from the library for free. I'm only scratching the surface here. Take some time and play it with A to Z databases. Now, A to Z databases, if you're not familiar, Reference USA, if you're not familiar, are both available from a ton of libraries. Most libraries have one or the other. If your library doesn't have one or the other, go borrow a library card from a neighboring library who has access to this data. Start using it. Almost no library knows that they can do this kind of targeting with a database that you guys already offer for free to the public, that the public can come in and use right now. So here's what it looks like. If I pulled up a list of, I don't remember what I pulled up here, but we get their name, we get their address, we get their city, their zip code, and we get their phone number. This is all you need to upload into Facebook. Here's how you do it. Now, this is business.facebook.com, and you have to have that. You get this black bar across the top that says pages, and when you click on that hamburger in the top left corner, you'll get this menu. And you go to this menu, and this is where your options are to use some of these data things. And in this case, if you click on audiences, you'll click on audiences. And once you click on audiences, you'll get this menu where you can upload that customer list. Now, you can create a custom audience in a bunch of different ways. People who go to your website, you can use Facebook Pixels. We're going to talk a lot about this in the digital advocacy webinar next. But people who visit your website, people who use your app, people who get your Instagram business profile, people who attend your events, people who come from your lead forms, a bunch of different ways you can build these custom audiences, and you can target them with these kinds of ads. Now, we've really just scratched the surface here, but there's other platforms where you can do some really interesting targeting. Now, if you go to your local newspaper, they'll tell you what the demographic is of their readership. And the demographic of their readership is what drives your ad material, not the other way around. So if you know that they are older, if you know that they are more Republican leaning, then you would put ads in those newspapers that use maybe some more conservative language to talk about libraries. You talk about the library, for example, as a hand-up organization instead of a handout organization. You talk about how the library helps people pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get back to work, right? If it's a newspaper that is mostly read by younger liberals, then maybe you talk about how you're helping other communities, how you're helping other people in different ways. You can build your databases on Excel or Google Sheets. Please use some kind of platform to build these lists. If you don't have that central database, you aren't using big data. You just you aren't using big data. We're going to dive really deeply into Nation Builder in the next webinar. Salesforce or CRM or another CRM. Salesforce is great, but it is so overpowered for what we need in a library. It's a lot. Platforms like Nation Builder let you build all of this data, understand profiles, do micro-targeting, have GIS software, have volunteer software, have event management software, and all of it's all built in and leading to a central database that helps you build these amazing profiles. MailChimp and Constant Contact have tags. Please use those. Those are incredible. There's Salsa Labs, Network for Good that we talked about earlier that help you do a lot of donor cultivation around this kind of big data. If you have questions, once again, please feel free to reach out to me. Online as PC Sweeney, and we can dive into it even more. You can also put a time to chat on my calendar at calendly.com/PC Sweeney. I'd love to have a chat with you. And of course, don't forget to check out our books from Neil Schuman and ALA Editions called Influencing Politicians and Winning Elections, and our other book, Before the Ballot, about how to build support for campaigns before your campaign starts. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you at the next webinar.